Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn here with a setup and wiring guide for Corsair's RS140 ARGB fans. In this video I'm going to show you how to directly connect these fans to your motherboard, but also how to control the RGB lighting really simply to make it look really good in your case, and how to set it up so that it will react to what's going on in your game to make for an immersive experience. I'm going to talk to you about the wiring logic of the RS140 ARGB fans, but this also applies to the RS120s as well. So it will help you no matter what you're doing with your build. It's worth noting the RS140 ARGBs come in packs of 2, and basically everything you need for them is inside the box. So you'll find screws and extension leads. But before I get started on the wiring, I wanted to show you one thing that's important, and that's knowing how to install them, which way around they go. You'll see that you have obviously the front and back of the fans, but there's also some arrows on the side here to indicate the direction of airflow. It's worth noting this because you can also get reverse blade fans, which are different, but these are the standard fans. Air is basically pulled through the front. If you can see the front of the fan blades, that's where the air is being pulled through and then pushed into the case. So in this build, at this stage, the front fans that you can see on the front of the case are set to intake, and then you put a dust filter there to protect it from dust ingress. If you're doing intake fans on the bottom of the case, you put them face down so they pull air from below with this same sort of logic. So for a build like this, the fan setup might look like this: intake on the front and side and bottom, exhaust on the top. And that's how that would be set up to make it a little bit clearer for you, hopefully. With each of the fans, you'll find they have 4 connectors on them, and this might look a bit intimidating at first, but essentially you've got 2 for fan power and 2 for RGB. 1 male and female of each of those versions. So you'll see pins on a couple of them and not on the other. The idea of this is essentially allowing you to daisy chain the fans together so that you can connect 2 fans together really easily, or 3, and I'll show you the process for that. So you take the male RGB connector that you can see here and plug it into the female RGB connector of the next fan in the group, and basically that'll allow the RGB signal to pass from one fan to the next, and then you'll have a cable that I'll get to in a minute which will plug into the motherboard. And then you have this connector, which is the fan power connector. Again, same sort of logic. Take the male connector and plug it into the female connector to make sure there's a connection between these 2 fans. So you can see this is a little bit fiddly, but this makes life really easy because it means not every fan has to be connected directly to the motherboard. The cables can get a little bit messy though, as you'll see, and they'll need to be hidden away when you're building, obviously. Now you can throw a 3rd fan into this setup. I'd recommend sticking to a maximum of 340mm fans connected directly to the motherboard, but you could use a controller. But essentially, again, we're repeating this process. So the 3rd fan is connected to the 2nd one we connected up in terms of chaining those RGB and fan power connectors together and just plugging those in. So it's fairly simple there, and then you've got those fans all connected up together, and then you have additional cables. So with each twin pack of RS140 ARGB fans, you get 2 extra cables. Watch out for these and don't lose them. These are the extension cables. So these are the ones that run from the group of fans that we've just set up to the motherboard. Again, same sort of logic, male and female connectors. So what you'll need to do here is to find the final bit of the connectors on the 3rd fan that will then allow you to plug these in so that you can end up with the female connectors then running to the motherboard. So for the RGB one, for example, you want to make sure you don't have the pins as the final section of the cable, and that'll make sense in a second as I'll show you this. So you'll see you'll then end up with a 5V RGB header and then a chassis fan or system fan header connection. So these are the 2 cables that you'll need to plug into the motherboard to power and control these fans. Now on most motherboards you should find you have plenty of connectors. Hopefully you've got at least 1 5V RGB connector. This motherboard I'm showing you has 3. And we also have multiple chassis fan headers or system fan headers. You'll find them in different positions, usually along the bottom of the motherboard, sometimes in other positions as well. But you can see we've got chassis fan headers on the right-hand side here, chassis fan 4 and 3. They might be marked as system fan instead, so SYS fan, but in this instance it's CHA fan. And then you'll see we have others throughout different positions on the motherboard. Now hopefully you'll have loads of these, and depending on how many fans you're putting into your system, you might not need that many because, as I've shown, you only need 1 connector for the fan power, for example, from a group of 3 fans. So you can see we've got 3 connectors here on the bottom middle of the motherboard. For the 5V RGB connector, we're looking for this one, which is a 3-pin connector, and you should find it's marked 5 volts, 5V, and also probably something like aDamatGeek or something similar. You can see this one's add_gen2_3 and _2. Those are 5V connections. You're just looking for a 3-pin connector. You might have to refer to your motherboard manual for it, but you should find them somewhere down the bottom. And then you'd plug the extension cable into that. So we're looking essentially to plug those 2 connectors into the motherboard, so the chassis fan header and the RGB connector, and then you'll be able to control the power and RGB lighting from your motherboard software and from the BIOS for those fans. Repeat this logic for any other groups of fans you want added into the system, and this applies to both RS120 and RS140 RGB fans, so you can connect them up. And obviously just plug them into the motherboard. Now I'm showing you this outside the build so it's really clear. Obviously you can actually do it once it's all installed. But you might find naturally that you run out of RGB connectors. If you're putting a lot of fans in, you might find suddenly you don't have enough. The solution here that's really easy is this Thermalright ARGB hub. This thing allows you to plug in a lot of RGB devices to it, and then it basically requires SATA power from your power supply unit and then a single connection from it that then plugs into the motherboard via that 5V RGB connector. With the sticky back tape you can see here, you can stick it to the back of your case, and that means you can hide the cables away. So rather than plugging all the different 5V RGB connectors in from the fan to the motherboard, you plug them into this controller, and then you have a single connection from this to the motherboard, which just makes it really clean and helps with cable management. But it also solves the problem if you've only got a couple of ports. Where do you plug these things in? So I'm plugging my fan connectors into it. I'm also plugging Corsair's Nautilus RGB cooler into it as well. So that's plugging in there. The fans on the radiator, the fans in the case. There's a lot of different connectors in there. You can plug up to 10 RGB devices into this if they use that same style of connector. So this makes for easy wiring and setup. Now you will require a SATA power connector, so you should have got one of these with your power supply unit. It is essentially the same cable that is used for your SSDs and hard disk drives and other things, but it's this flat connector. It usually has multiple connections on it. One end of it plugs into the power supply unit, and then you can plug several other devices into it really easily. So you'll see you're looking for a port marked SATA or PATA on the power supply. This is Corsair's RM Shift power supply unit. The other end has an L-shaped connector that usually plugs into an SSD. Now you can plug in multiple things to this, so if you've only got one of these cables, you should find you've hopefully got a spare connector that you can then plug into the Thermalright controller to power it. Obviously we've got a lot of devices going in there, so it needs to be powered in order to work properly. You then use this cable which comes with the Thermalright controller, which plugs into the far end, so the opposite end of the controller, like that, and then the other end of that simply plugs into the 5V RGB header on the motherboard. So now that thing is then sending the signal for all the fans in the case to that port on the motherboard. Makes life really easy, and it ensures that everything matches in terms of the RGB and it's all synced up really nicely. So that's really straightforward and simple. Now, if you're adding in a lot of fans into your build, obviously we've got a lot of cables going on here, then you might find that you have another problem, that maybe you run out of chassis fan headers as well. So I'm going to show you a solution for that. But the other thing to note is you could chain the RGB connectors where possible from one group of fans to the next, to the next, to the next. But that becomes a little bit fiddly, which is why I recommended the Thermalright ARGB hub, because it's just easier to use. Another good solution, and this helps if you don't have fan power, so if you haven't got enough chassis fan headers for your fans, is to get this Thermalright controller instead. I'll link to both of these in the description, but this one controls both fan power and RGB, so you can plug both connectors into this from the groups of fans. You can plug in up to 8 things into it, so fan power and RGB connections on both sides. It has the same sort of logic as the RGB one though, so you need to plug these into the motherboard still, so you have extension cables, and it also requires SATA power. But it does mean if you are running low on chassis fan headers or system fan headers on your motherboard, you can use this as an alternative. Now, basically, this is just repeating the signal from there, so it's not requiring any sort of software or anything like that. You can basically use your motherboard's BIOS and RGB controls. Once this is all connected up in the same way, it just sends the signal through to the fans, and it's universal, so it'll work with any fans that have the same connectors on them. But once you've finished, hopefully you end up with a build that looks something like this, where all the fans are working nicely and are powered. Now, I'd recommend going into your BIOS at this point and looking for the fan settings in there. If you find the headers that you've used, go into the settings and change them to PWM mode. You'll find that they'll then run at the right speed and they won't be too loud. If you've got any sort of tuning tools in the BIOS, I'd also recommend using those. In this BIOS, for example, it just runs through some tests to see what the fans can go up to and down to in terms of maximum, minimum RPM. It will then improve the tuning of them and the fan curve, and therefore ensure that they don't get too loud during use. So this is just really handy to do. So I'd recommend running this test and applying it if you can, but at least as a minimum putting them to PWM mode, because you'll just find that they'll run quieter when doing that. And then exit the BIOS and make sure you save changes and reset when doing this as well. Now, also, what you want to do is now download Signal RGB. You can use your motherboard software as an alternative to this, but Signal RGB is a free tool that is just fantastic with controlling your RGB lighting, and you should find that it works really nicely here. With a free account, you can access a number of different things. You can also create a basic account and log into it, and then you've got loads of different settings, and there is premium tiers. But even at the basic level, it just gives you some really nice RGB effects, including the one that I showed you where you can get it to mimic what's on the screen, so it will react to what happens on the screen really easily. Or you can just go through various different effects, and as you can see, you can apply them to everything. So it's applying to all the fans, the pump, anything in the system. Even the RAM is also being impacted by it, so it's really clever in terms of what it works with. You'll also find it working with peripherals, so it just makes the setup really straightforward. Hopefully you found this video useful. If you did, check out the links in the description to related videos. Also made guides on the Nautilus cooler, the Corsair case, and the wiring and setup of various other things in your system. Thanks very much for watching. Appreciate you.
You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.